Hi folks, this is Professor Kent Schwitkus again, and this is our section in regards to, as you can read myself, uh, life in the universe. A very interesting question. Are we the only folks around? Which it basically boils down to. Uh, it seems, as in the movie Contact, an awful waste of space if you consider it. There are lots of galaxies out there, just in the visible universe on the order of 200 billion, and then there's 200 billion stars. And we'll see that it's probably true that there are roughly, planets around every star that we see. All right, so let's continue on. When we discuss life in the universe, what do we really mean? And these are the topics that I'm going to be looking at. What is life? How do we define it? How did life evolve on the Earth? Some of you might believe that it happened in only a few days. Some of you might indicate that a day was thousands of years, but I take a different viewpoint, that being that life evolved. I mean, that's where the evidence lies. This is evidence that you and I can take a look at and agree or disagree, but it is not on faith. The evidence does not require faith. So the third topic would be, where does life exist on the Earth? Because we want to understand what is the breadth of the environment that life exists on the Earth, and can we find those environments outside of the Earth? And then the fourth item would be to talk about the Drake equation, which relates specifically to our ability to communicate with other intelligent species out there. And then I will end up with a little discussion of the Fermi paradox, which sort of is counter to the whole idea of the Drake equation, basically asking the question, well, if there's so many life forms out there that are intelligent, why haven't we seen them yet? And in that regard, I don't mean people that have rednecks or in old beat-up pickup trucks that nobody would ever believe. Okay, so why didn't they land in the Washington Mall, for example? Okay, so in my face-to-face class, I would ask these two questions, and then I would try to get you guys involved into what is it that we normally characterize as life, and what do we need for life? And hopefully you would come up with similar answers as my students, and basically you being my students, and these are some of the things that are required, and what we mean by life. The ability to reproduce, to extract energy out of the environment, the ability to evolve, and then you have to be somewhat self-repairing, basically. You scratch yourself and then you don't immediately bleed out and die. There is some repair mechanism that allows you to survive small injuries. Now, this leads us to the next question, is what is required for life? And on this planet, at least, it seems as though liquid water is one of the primary requisites. It is what is called a universal solvent. And if you think about the systems in your body, the lymphatic system, the circulation, and nervous system and things like that, they are all based on liquid water. Liquid water is a natural way of dissolving materials and transporting them around very, very easily. And so for that reason, we think liquid water is a requirement. Then you need also some sort of energy. I mean, you're going to be doing some stuff, creating carbon compounds like proteins, sugars, and then you're going to be utilizing those compounds later on. So you need some way of driving that, and that requires energy. Then secondly, you need some way of organizing these materials to form different structures, and carbon seems to be the one element that is most common out there that does have that property. Think about it. A girl's best friend is a diamond, which is just carbon in a particular form, a crystalline shape. And then if you look across the way, you can see some fake or some cabinet material that looks like wood. At one point, it was real wood. But the point is that that has a very different characteristic than a diamond does. And we can form it and we can shape it. We can build things out of it, build buildings out of it, what have you. The point being, though, is that this carbon compounds have all sorts of different structures that you can create out of them. Some that are flat and slip over each other, others that are very strong. And we utilize these compounds in our bodies in tremendous variation, and it's just amazing. And those sorts of things we see all around us as well. So carbon is very useful in sort of creating structures that we don't normally see out there. Okay, now, according to the National Academy, this is what we ought to be looking for when we're looking for life out there. As we see in the first one, Terran life uses water. Life is built out of cells, exploits a particular energy characteristic. We use chemical energy to run life, as opposed to other things like gravity or the strong or the weak nuclear forces. And then we have some mechanism for sending our information into the next generation, which is this last thing talking about, essentially nucleic acids. Well, okay, so we have some idea of what life is about, and now we would like to see how did life evolve on Earth, because in a sense, we would hope that conditions would be like this in other locales, and if we understand how this sort of thing occurred on Earth, perhaps we can understand how things would appear outside of Earth and perhaps make some predictions and find out that we're either right or wrong. Well, Urey and Mayer conducted this experiment in 1953, and they proposed that DNA and RNA could be created. And what they wanted to do was take something that looked like a primordial Terran atmosphere. So they used methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water, and they just banged it with an electric spark, and this was to simulate lightning in the early Earth. Lightning is very prevalent around volcanoes, and as you might remember, when we talked about Earth and its evolution as a planet, very early on there was lots of volcanism, and so we would expect lightning coming from volcanoes in this early Earth and giving rise to the energy necessary to create other atoms from, or other molecules from simpler molecules that we see here. And so that is the mechanism for adding energy. And after a week or so, they discovered that in this little tube here, that whole bunch of chemicals built up, and quite a few of them were amino acids. So the experiment is displayed here symbolically. We have a flask here which you boil water. The water comes up here, and we have, have gases in here of the primordial Earth, methane, water, ammonia, that sort of thing. We have a spark being generated, and then we cool it down to create a symbolic rain, if you will. And we just continue this process going, and after a week, chemicals built up here. Now, there is a video that I can show you of Julia Child creating some primordial soup, which is what we call this stuff. But I won't go there this time. If you want to see it, you have to come into my office hours. Now, what Urey and Mayer found were they reported 5 amino acids: glycine, which is this guy down here, alanine, alpha and beta alanine aspartic acid, and then aminobutyric acid. So they were able to create some pretty amazing stuff. And later on, J. Bada, Miller's student, inherited his experiment, and they went back and looked at the chemicals that were in the vials of the experiment, and they found 25 more. And so the point being is that it wasn't just one amino acid. They found a whole slew of them. And besides that, there was a meteorite that hit Australia in 1969, and they found 90 different amino acids on this thing, of which 19 are here used in Terran life forms. So pretty amazing stuff. But if you look out further into space, what you do see is a plethora, I love that word, just a whole bunch of different organic molecules out there in interstellar space. Let me remind you that when it comes to determining what these molecules and elements are, we have a handle on that. We just take the spectrum of the gases that we're looking at out there, and the spectrum just tells us what's there. And so as I've inherited a lot of charts, but basically the point is this: if you look at simple compounds, looking at the number of atoms, I've organized this thing going from 2 atoms to more than 12. And basically what we find out here is we have some very, very complicated structures. Buckyballs were only discovered in the past 10 or 20 years, and it's basically the shape of a soccer ball, even more complex than the shape of a soccer ball, with a carbon atom at each one of those vertices. Very, very complicated structures we see out in interstellar space. So something as simple as a glycine molecule that is necessary for amino acids or DNA and RNA, and that stuff is out there. So that isn't a surprise. What is a surprise is that it took us so long. All right, well, this whole idea of creating life from nothing is still continuing going on. There's all sorts of questions. In the 1950s, there was a question of why is it that all the DNA and RNA and the proteins that are in our bodies are left-handed or right-handed versions rather than left-handed versions. This is a detailed chemistry question. What is left-handed, what is right-handed? But what isn't a detailed chemistry question is why these molecules, or why life prefers one set of molecules rather than the other set. This was proposed in the 1950s, but it wasn't until a few years ago that people actually measured, actually conducted an experiment to test the hypothesis. And the testing was done with various types of radiation, and they found out that radiation alters the left-handed molecules faster than the right-handed. So life would prefer something that didn't denature with cosmic rays as readily as something else. So it preferentially chose right-handed molecules. So now, mind you, we still haven't started with a Urey-Mayer experiment, and actually watched creatures coming out of the test tubes, okay? So we haven't done that yet, but, science marches on. Okay, and this also continues in looking at the molecules in exoplanet regimes, and we're finding that the chemical compositions of these molecular clouds out there are the same as what we see around us. So, the Copernican idea still continues. We're really not special. Perhaps, well, we are unique and all that, but the conditions that created life on this planet and intelligent life on this planet are probably not unique in the universe, okay? So we're finding that the chemistry works the same here as it does out there. There's molecules out here and out there. We see these simple ideas, simple experiments holding true with experiments we run on the ground here. And then we see the chemical analogs out in space too. So it's got to lead you to an inescapable conclusion that, life is out there too. Now, the next step we want to get into is talking about life on Earth, and part of that is basically giving you a quick history lesson about life on Earth. And basically we find that life took very little effort in being created. We have this chart is indicative of going backwards in time. So this is near the birth of the solar system and the birth of the Earth, if you will. And the crust is cooling. Remember, we have all this bombardment of comets and asteroids and the planet getting bigger. And, it's basically molten at this time. And so, well, obviously, life can't survive in lava, but it can survive in pretty hot temperatures, we'll see. Well, okay, so we have fossil records that go back very, very far, and I would love to get a fossil stromatolite, which I'll show you in a little bit. But basically, during this time frame, life started, and life would have oxygen as a byproduct. It wasn't using carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It was basically running off of hydrogen sulfide, sort of underwater and things like that, which we see around smokers in the deep sea. And was utilizing that and giving off oxygen as a byproduct. And during this period of time here, oxygen was getting into the atmosphere because the ground and the waters had absorbed as much oxygen as they could get. Now remember, oxygen is a very reactive component in our atmosphere. If you leave a nail outside, for example, it just rusts. Iron oxide, okay? Lots of things rust. And so what we're seeing here in this beginning where life first occurred until oxygen is starting to be released in the atmosphere, the rocks here are oxidizing. So all the iron is turning into rust and things like that. And we have lots of, blue-green algae doing that. And after 1 billion years or so, we started getting types of cells. It's first thought that they were viruses inside of regular cells, but we already had cells which were defined inside versus outside, but eukaryotic cells, if I got the pronunciation right, basically says that I have a cell with a nucleus inside, where I have an extra layer, an extra wall, if you will, protecting the genetic material that I'm going to pass on to my progeny. And then basically nothing much happened until we get to about 1 billion, less than 1 billion years ago, where we started getting cells grouping together and performing separate functions. Now, all these three guys, sponges, jellyfish, and flatworms, are basically colonies of cells, but if I separate them, then they regenerate in their entirety, right? You can cut a flatworm in two, and it will grow a new head and it'll grow a new tail if I cut it up into 2 bits. And so a very, very simple idea, but basically, somebody handles the digestion, somebody handles the brain functions, but if something happens to those cells that I call the stomach, then I can regenerate them completely because everybody has the same information. And then, obviously you and I can't do that. But about 500 million years ago, we had what is called the Cambrian explosion, where as soon as colonization or specificity, or, cells became specific, some became eyes, some became stomachs, some became brains, then all sorts of new things could happen. And during this Cambrian explosion, basically all types of life forms, structures became sort of set in stone, if you will. Now, I do have a I don't have a picture here of what I own, but I do have a trilobite. Trilobites are from this period of time, 500 million years ago, and there is a region in California in between Barstow and the river called the Trilobite Wilderness. Now, that does not mean you see these little critters walking around. No, but there are there's a Latham shale out there where you can go out there and see if you can find some of these. Now, I was lucky in that I have a specimen that a friend gave me, and she picked it up before it turned into a wilderness. And if you go out there now, it's against the law. Wildernesses are, you can touch, but you cannot take. Now, this guy over here on the left is a fossil stromatolite, which is these very early, 400 billion year old fossils from when life first started. And so let's see I guess I don't have any more notes on this, but basically this is from a region in Australia, and in the western portion, Sharks Bay, I believe. But what we observe here is that life prefers lighter elements. So it will preferentially choose carbon-12 and oxygen-16 in its matrix, because we're talking about chemistry, and that is using electromagnetism, and the mass of the atom matters. And if you can utilize a lower mass atom, then the energy required to create a protein is less. So if you are pulling carbon out from the environment, then you would choose carbon-12 rather than carbon-13 or carbon-14. Same is true for oxygen-16 versus 18. So basically, we look at rocks like this and then determine how much carbon-12 or oxygen-16 there is relative to the environment. And if we see there's a lot more than we would see in the ratios, then there is a supposition that this is life. Now, that's one thought as to this proof, and that's about as far as I've gotten there. It is rather controversial when I go that far back, with 4 billion years to say I've got a fossil here, but I would certainly like to look more into that. All right, evolutionary biology, or if you will, what is evolution? It's based upon these three concepts. You have a common ancestry, and you have descent with modification. And then you have a process by which these changes are selected. So you can have natural selection or drift. And then you have relationships between these different organisms. So if you will, you have a thing that you can call the tree of life, where things are related to each other. Now, evolution via natural selection is based upon these three facts. And as I say down here, it's the strongest cause for adaptability on the planet. So it's, these are three very simple ideas that Darwin utilized to come up with, evolution via natural selection. And he did not have genetic information available on these on plants and animals, and we do. So we can see how the modification of the individual occurs because of the range of variation in individuals relative to the population, and we can see we can conduct experiments to see which one of these traits is survivable. For example, the gypsy moth in England is prime examples for that. And then we know about genetics, which allows these traits to be inherited from one population in time to the next. So we have these three ideas, and there isn't anything that's, there are very few theories that are as strongly supported by evidence as these three. Okay, what kind of environments support life? Or what kind of environment does life require? And if you think about it in a simplistic way, as I indicate down here, these things are requirements that we would imply are necessary for us. If we go outside, we get cold or we get hot. We have to put clothes on or take them off. If we get too hot, there's a chance of dehydration. If we get cold, there's hypothermia. There are all sorts of examples like that. I can have too much water in my system, not enough salt. I can have too little water. If I go outside and I go out to the beach, I can get a sunburn and I complain about that. And God forbid I should put my hands around a car battery without putting gloves on. It does wonders for my skin. And so you might think that life requires something very, very specific. And what I want to indicate to you is that might not be true. Okay, there are these things called exophiles or extremophiles, and they can live anywhere, it seems. The first one I've got there is these water bears, and these guys have been taken up to the space station and left out there for nearly a couple of weeks, and then they got rewatered, and most of them survived. And then if you go to down here, here's a picture of an aerial picture of a hot spring in Yosemite, or in not Yosemite but Yellowstone, starts with a Y. And these areas, which are sort of strangely colored, we've got a bunch of microbes there. And see this water coming off? That's steam. Steam is at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. This water is boiling. And we've got critters running around here that are living. And then there's these smokers that are, in the deep ocean in steam vents. And they're pulling in stuff that's heated up by lava, and they're living just fine, thank you, and they're big. These worms are, several feet high, and they are pulling, they're using a mechanism that we utilized on the Saturn V rocket, which is bring the cold water in and get it close to your cell wall, and you can keep cool. And it's just pretty amazing what life can figure out how to do. But just points out to you that we have these critters that are floating around, and they can have learned, kind of an odd way of using the word learn, but they have modified their structure so that they can live in very, very severe conditions that you and I wouldn't necessarily work with very well. But on the other hand, we can also say the same thing. With our brains, we have made new types of skin, put them on our hands, and we can lift a car battery without any problem at all. They're called gloves. If it gets too cold, we get, some other animal's fur and put it around our backs. If it gets too hot, we put water over ourselves. So, the point is that we need to consider life forms as having the abilities that we would normally associate with our brains and our tools. Life has seemed to been able to do the same thing. So we need to expand our view of what is possible as far as living beings are concerned in other locales. Okay, so that's where we'll leave off at right now. And part 2, we'll be talking about we'll be talking about the Drake equation, and then we'll start looking for evidences of, say, of water, which we think is required for everything. Although, on the planet Titan, not the planet Titan, but the moon Titan going around Saturn, there might be something even stranger yet. Okay, thank you guys.